Now for the exciting conclusion of my 30-day advance sermon. So to catch you up to speed, for those of you not here last week, I'm just back from my 7-week sabbatical after being with you all here for 8 years, and I am very grateful for the time, and I understand more than ever how critical such time is for, among other things, recalibrating, renewing my own relationship with God as I work to support you in yours. And so I spent 4 of the weeks in Colorado at a Jesuit retreat center doing a silent 30-day retreat in the Ignatian spiritual exercises. I'm calling this 2-part sermon my 30-day advance because, as I talked about last week, I experienced it not so much as a retreat from the world, despite the silence and isolation of it, but rather an advance into a deeper frequency of the world. So someone mentioned to me a scene from a Peter O'Toole movie from the 70s that I want to begin with today, where the protagonist, Jack Gurney, thinks he is Jesus. And when he's asked by someone, "How do you know that you are God?" he says, "It's simple. When I pray to him, I find I'm talking to myself." So there is this fine line, I have to say, in prayer between talking to ourselves and talking to God, between listening to ourselves and listening to God. And that's part of the trickiness of prayer, or the difficulty of it, I would say. I do not love when I hear someone say, "God put it on my heart to tell you this, that, or the other thing." I don't know if anybody's ever said that to you. But I don't like that very much. Or worse yet, when someone unloads their own issues or personal responsibility, "God told me to do this, that, or the other thing." But there's a pitfall on the other side also, where because of the ambiguity or uncertainty inherent in relating to an unseen spirit, that we just go with what our 5 senses can ascertain, and we miss out on the deeper truth of life and forsake our effort to talk to God, our effort to listen, really listen for God, because it does take effort, and to have a personal relationship with Jesus. So how do you cut a path between where you can lean into a practice of prayer and communication with God that's honest and vital and dynamic and enhances your life and commitment to what is good and right, but not imaginary and irrational that so easily turns to justifying self and and judging others, right? So St. Ignatius of the 16th century, he stepped right into that fine line when he developed the spiritual exercises. That was the process that I went through in the 30 days of my retreat. And he stepped right into that because he encourages people to lean heavily on the imagination as a vehicle for communicating with and experiencing God. He said that since our imagination is God-given, it's a vital and powerful tool for experiencing and knowing God better. So in the spiritual exercises, a person is guided through prayer to imagining yourself in various engagements with Christ, especially in various biblical stories. So I did this throughout my 30 days, and in prayer times throughout each day, as my spiritual director would guide me through the general arc over the 30 days of the gospel, the birth narrative, the teachings and healings of Jesus, his encounters with various people along the way, and his passion, death, and resurrection. So that's part of what I did, is I placed myself imaginatively within the stories as a way of encountering Jesus anew and coming to know him and therefore the risen Christ better. Sometimes in the process, the scripture or an encounter with Jesus was remarkable and illuminating. things I hadn't realized about really familiar passages, and sometimes there wasn't much. The time felt empty and flat. And that is simply the nature of prayer and relationship with God, truthfully, right? However you do it. Sometimes it's rich and engaging, and sometimes not so much. True also of all of our other relationships, right? But for sure, after 30 days of doing the deep dive into prayer, I came away with a deeper heart connection to Christ and what has felt like a renewal of my relationship with Him. So I'll share with you one instance that was one of the more dramatic moments of the retreat for me, and you can decide for yourself if that encounter was imaginary or God working in and through my imagination. You can guess where I'd put my money. So somewhere in the third week of the retreat, we moved from a reflection on the passion and death of Jesus to the resurrection. So on their property, in this beautiful spot on their property with the Rocky Mountains in the distance and under this great sky, western sky, not far from where the hummingbird dipped herself in the stream that I shared last week, they had this beautiful series of the Stations of the Cross, these big stone stations of the cross with images of each step along that way. If you're familiar with the Stations of the Cross, Jesus falls for the first time. The women of Jerusalem encounter Jesus. There's 14 of those. So there's these big, beautiful stones with images carved into them of the stations. And you could walk up to them and meditate with them and pray with those images. That was one of my prayer times within the passion part of my process, was walking up to these stations and meditating with them. But it was the next day when the prayer prompts were focused on Jesus in the tomb and the grief of the disciples that this took place. So my spiritual director, Father Ed, who I did talk to 30 minutes each day, so I wasn't silent for 30 full days. 30 minutes a day I could talk and share what was happening for me in the time away and in my prayer experience, and to get guidance for my upcoming prayer times. He invited me to spend some time in my imagination with Mary and the disciples in the emptiness of Holy Saturday, right? The grief, in the grief of Jesus' loss after his death before his resurrection. He also invited me to bring my mother into the scene in my imagination, to be with them because of her grief at my father's death, which had occurred just before I went on the retreat. And so I did that for the day in my various prayer times. And honestly, there wasn't a whole lot there. The prayer times that day felt mostly dry, and I struggled to get into them. I guess in a certain way, that was appropriate. Sometimes grief isn't wailing and weeping and outpouring of emotion, but a scraped out, raw emptiness that leaves you emotionless, right? I guess that was more what that day and those prayer times felt like. And I usually did my 4 prayer times in the Hermitage, in this little house, sitting in a rocking chair there and looking out the window that overlooked the distant valley and the great sky of the west. And so I came to my final prayer time of the day, which was usually at about 6 p.m., and I sat back down in the rocker with a bit of a humph and a sigh to do my last prayer hour of the day. And Father Ed had suggested that at the end of the day, I enter the scene again with the disciples and allow Mary Magdalene to come into the scene and announce to all those gathered that Jesus was resurrected. So I sat down, closed my eyes, went back into the scene in my imagination, and was there for a short time with the disciples and my mother and envisioned Mary coming in with the news that Jesus was resurrected. I had my eyes closed and my head in my hands like this. And as soon as Mary, in my imagination, announced the news in my mind and heart's eyes, I just happened to lift up my head and open my eyes and looked out the window. And in that moment there, out in the valley, was the most complete and vivid rainbow that I have ever seen in my life. It was not there when I went into my prayer time, closed my eyes, bowed my head. When I looked up, boom, it was there. It was remarkable. I laughed out loud, got up from the chair and walked out onto the little deck of my hermitage, and with a stupid smile on my face, I just watched it. It seemed to grow more vivid and intense, and then eventually began to fade away. All the while thanking God with laughter for this sign. What a sign! Talk about a sign. It seemed to me a pretty clear word from God, not only of the truth of the resurrection, but what came along with it was this sense of my Father. And all the dead, for that matter, being swept up in the beauty and the glory and love of Christ's resurrection. It was incredible. I'd say it's hard to write it off as simply me talking to myself in my imagination because of the collusion of the natural world with my imagination. Come on now, right? The rainbow. It's a sign of promise and hope in many spiritual traditions, a lot of them, especially in Jewish lore. It's the promise that God gives to Noah and his animal companions that God will never again destroy life, despite the violence and depravity of humankind, but always protect and preserve it. It's not a symbol that comes into play all that often in the New Testament around Jesus' resurrection necessarily, except in Revelation 4, where it says, "After these things I looked, and behold, a door opened in heaven, and a rainbow was around the throne of God." And the resurrection is this culmination of God's promise made to Noah as you look at the arc of the whole story. The resurrection, the passion and death of Jesus was another moment of revealing humanity's awful penchant towards self-justification, pride, violence, focused like a magnifying glass, gathering with intensity and searingly focused on the Son of Man, Son of God, Jesus Christ. There on Calvary, God's self receives the hate and violence that humanity is capable of, and like a conflagration is destroyed in it. And yet that horrible but good moment releases from it something of a bow or an arc, not of destructive power raining down as a result from the divine, but rather a bow of light and color and love, not punishing but protecting, not vengeful but forgiving, not dominating but inviting humanity into an eternity, thanks to the transformation, an eternity with God's love, thanks to the transformation and transfiguration effect of Jesus' great love. You see, in all that he did, he acted freely and simply from the depths of his heart, moved by love. And it transfigured not just his life, but generations of lives across the ages, across the globe, and continues to do so. And all it takes is a turning to him in prayer and in faith, in imagination and in heart. And the truth of it, the effect of it, can be experienced. If you are not sure about that yourself, or it's not in your experience, then an old adage of the Christian faith is simply act as though it is true and see what happens. Pray as though the risen Christ is right there with you in the room. Talk to him. Unburden your heart. In your imagination, draw others into that circle with him and be in his presence. What do you feel? What do you want to say? What do you want to hear from him? Are you talking to yourself, or are you talking to God when you're doing that? No telling. Maybe sometimes it's God, other times it's your own head, maybe sometimes both. But in my experience, it seems pretty clear when it's what I'm making up or just wanting to hear versus what seems to be coming from deeper within me or well beyond me. Acknowledging that we can't know absolutely is pretty important for not running off the deep end with it. And forever in our tradition, we have held that our spiritual journeys, our relationship with God, can't be exclusively an individual thing, that that's a problem when it becomes exclusively an individual thing. In part to protect against believing ourselves eventually to be God, right? And this is the gift of the church, because our community can help hold us into relationship and into honesty in relationship with God. Our community will let us know if what we believe we are hearing from God seems to maybe not be so much from God, or remarkably probably is. Sounds pretty dead on. That'd be the resurrected Christ speaking to you, I would guess. And that's part of my role as your pastor, and Maeve's as your associate pastor, is to be in conversation with you around your spiritual journeys and what you are hearing and not hearing and needing and seeking and trying to believe and struggling to believe and believing. And I want to remind you that we are always happy to make ourselves available to you for those conversations. We love those conversations, right? And so that's the heart of what I wanted to share with you from my 30-day retreat. It's a lot of words coming, isn't it, from 30 days of silence? I didn't think so, but Tracy said after my month there, the day I returned, I was like, talk. But it was such a gift to be silent, and it is such a gift to speak and communicate with the world around us in words and signs and actions, and to hear that back from God and from one another. Thank you for the time. I pray that this summer, as you go about your lives and experience beautiful places and hopefully take a little slower pace to your life, that you can better hear God speaking to you in love and respond in kind. Because what you'll hear from God is really, really good news. That's what you'll hear from God, about God's profound love for you and for the world. And then what do you do when you receive that love? But share that. And that's the good news, as the choir will now sing as the deacons collect our offering.